My journey kicked off in a way I hadn't expected. I was set to attend a conference in Minneapolis on Thursday and Friday, but the send-off was far from the usual warm, heartfelt goodbye. Typically, my wife, Hannah, would take half a day off work just to make sure I felt special before heading out. This time, though, all I got was a quick peck on the cheek before she rushed off to work, barely saying goodbye. Before I go on, let me tell you a bit about myself. My name's Liam. I'm 49, been married to Hannah for 24 long years, and we have 2 kids together. Finn is 22, and Sophie just turned 20. We've had a pretty good life together, or so I thought. But that day felt off from the start. The journey itself began around 3 in the afternoon. I wrapped up work and made my way to the airport. I'm the type who likes to get their way ahead of time, especially for a 6 p.m. flight. It gives me some peace of mind, knowing I won't be cutting it close. Everything was smooth sailing, at least until I got to the gate. That's when my luck started running thin. Turns out, the flight to Minnesota was delayed because of some nasty weather and a snowstorm that was rolling in. After what felt like an eternity, about 45 minutes, we finally boarded. I figured, all right, we're back on track. But about 30 minutes into the flight, I noticed something odd. The plane started to veer to the left. At first, I didn't think much of it, but when we kept turning, it hit me. We were going back. The pilot soon confirmed it. The storm was too dangerous for us to land in Minneapolis, so we had to return to where we started. Great, just my luck. Once we touched down, I raced to the airline counter, desperate to salvage my plans. Thankfully, I snagged one of the last seats on the next flight out. Still, the conference would start without me, but I was determined to make it. I called my contact in Minneapolis and left a voicemail for my boss, letting them know about the delay. Then, almost instinctively, I dialed home, hoping to hear Hannah's familiar, reassuring voice. But when the phone rang, no one answered. That wasn't like her. When I pulled up to the house, I noticed the driveway was empty. Her car was gone. A pit formed in my stomach, but I pushed it down. I grabbed my luggage, stepped inside, and immediately heard voices. For a second, I thought someone was in the living room, but it was just the TV, blaring away. That's when it hit me. Hannah must have come home, and I distinctly remembered turning the TV off before I left. So, why was it on? I turned it off and wandered around the house, looking for any sign of her. Nothing. Starting to feel uneasy, I called her cell. When she finally picked up, she acted all casual, asking where I was. Her voice had this strange warmth, as if she cared, but it felt forced. She told me she was at home, just watching some TV shows. As she spoke, I felt the exhaustion of my day creeping in. All I wanted was to come home, be with my wife, and spend some time together. After all, I had a few unexpected hours to kill, thanks to the delay. But something wasn't right. Within half a minute, the relief I'd felt earlier vanished, replaced by an overwhelming sense of dread. Instead of anticipating a cozy night with the woman I thought I knew, doubts started to flood my mind. Was she lying to me? Had she been cheating? I didn't want to believe it, but I couldn't shake the feeling. What could have pushed her to deceive me? Was it someone from work? Or maybe one of her friends? None of it made sense. I must have been quiet for too long because her voice snapped me out of my thoughts. "Are you still there?" she asked, sounding concerned. I muttered something about landing in O'Hare and needing to go, then hung up abruptly. She called back right after, but I couldn't bring myself to answer. I just needed time alone to make sense of what I was feeling. I sat down on the couch, staring into the quiet void of the house. Why would Hannah lie to me? Maybe there was a logical explanation. I tried to convince myself it was nothing, or maybe even a surprise she was planning for me. I mean, I had done something similar a few years ago for our 20th anniversary. I'd orchestrated this elaborate surprise, even roping in her boss and her parents. Maybe this was her payback, and I was just overthinking everything. Still, there was one nagging thought I couldn't get rid of. Could Hannah have actually been unfaithful? No, not us. That just didn't seem possible. But then again, was I being naive? That's when I thought of Sophie. If anyone knew what Hannah was up to, it would be our daughter. I quickly dialed her number. Her familiar voice greeted me on the other end, full of warmth. She asked how I was, and we exchanged pleasantries. I asked her if she had talked to her mom recently, hoping for some kind of clue. Sophie mentioned they'd had their usual weekly call on Sunday, which gave me a flicker of hope. I decided to test the waters and asked if she knew about any surprise Hannah might be planning. I wasn't fishing for details, just wanted to know if something was in the works. My voice carried a bit of anticipation as I waited for her answer. But her response crushed that small hope. She didn't know anything about a surprise, and then she asked me what was going on, completely unaware of the storm brewing in my mind. Not wanting to worry her, I fumbled for an excuse and told her Hannah had been acting a little odd lately, and I was wondering if she was hiding something nice, maybe for my upcoming 50th birthday. Sophie shot that down right away, reminding me that we'd already celebrated my birthday last month. Feeling defeated, I wished her a good night, and she responded with a slight hint of disappointment in her voice. The truth was becoming harder to avoid. There was no surprise. The question still lingered. Why would Hannah lie to me? As I sat there, possible explanations started bubbling up in my head. Maybe it had something to do with a promotion. That seemed plausible, right? She'd been working late more and more, driven by her dedication to climbing that corporate ladder. I tried to convince myself that she was just laser-focused on that elusive promotion. But deep down, I knew. No title at work was worth the time we'd been losing together. She knew I'd asked her to cut back her hours so we could reconnect, spend more time together like we used to. It wasn't an unreasonable request. The irony of the situation didn't escape me. I had turned down a big promotion myself, just a few months before our 20th anniversary. Almost 5 years ago, I had been offered the position of vice president of finance at my company, which came with all the bells and whistles. But it also meant regular travel to Chicago and bouncing around different factories across the country. At first, I was excited. Who wouldn't be? But Hannah, well, she didn't share my enthusiasm. She pointed out the pitfalls immediately. A guy I worked with had taken a similar position and ended up divorced within 2 years. Sure, he was rolling in money, but the price was loneliness and misery. And with Finn and Sophie still needing guidance through their last years of school, Hannah didn't want to be left handling everything on her own. She had a point, so we talked. A lot. Those were deep conversations, the kind that make you realize what's truly important. Eventually, it became clear. I was losing sight of what really mattered. My family. My wife. So, I turned the job down and decided to prioritize them over some fancy title and a bigger paycheck. Now, though, things were different. Hannah was the one pushing hard for a promotion, and it had stirred up doubts I hadn't felt in years. With the kids off at college, it was just the two of us. She seemed to think that getting ahead at work wouldn't change much, maybe a few more business trips here and there. But the overtime was getting to me. Seeing her for an hour or two during the week wasn't enough. We'd lost that closeness, and it wasn't just in our daily lives. Our intimacy had all but disappeared. The last time we'd been physically close? I couldn't even remember. Was it 3 weeks ago? A month? The details were fuzzy, lost in the haze of routine and exhaustion. I knew age played a role in the dwindling passion, but the lack of connection between us weighed heavily. Maybe her strange behavior on the phone was just her avoiding the conversation, hiding behind her job. Still, I couldn't ignore the fact that I was on a business trip too, and I occasionally worked late myself. But if I wanted to know the truth, there was a simple way to find out. I decided to call Hannah's direct line at T-Bold, the advertising agency she worked at. I figured I'd confirm whether she was really still at work, just to settle my mind. When the phone was answered, though, it wasn't Hannah. It was Ryan Mitchell, one of her colleagues. Startled, I had to quickly compose myself. I was expecting Hannah's voice, not his. I greeted him by my usual nickname, trying to keep things casual. But then he said something that hit me like a freight train. He joked that I should be enjoying my vacation with Hannah. Vacation? What vacation? My heart sank, and confusion took over. Something was definitely wrong. I stammered out a few words, asking him about this so-called vacation, trying to make sense of it all. Realizing I was spiraling, I quickly pulled myself together, apologized for the interruption, and made up some lame excuse about dialing the wrong number. But inside, I knew this was no mistake. Something was going on, and it wasn't good. Ryan reassured me without a hint of suspicion, casually mentioning that Hannah owed him lunch for covering her late shifts. He vented a bit, complaining about how it was already 9 in the evening, and he was still stuck at the office. With that, he wrapped up the call and hung up. Slowly, the awful truth began to settle in. Hannah wasn't at work, and according to Ryan, she was actually on vacation until the end of the week. Panic began creeping into my chest, tightening like a vice. Where the hell was Hannah? What could she possibly be doing? The unthinkable started to take shape in my mind, no matter how much I tried to push it away. I've always believed in seeing the good in people, always been someone who values kindness and trusts those close to me. But now, against my will, my thoughts turned dark. Could it really be true? Could Hannah be betraying me like this? The idea of her spending time with her sister, Natalie, suddenly popped into my head. It wasn't a thought I wanted, but there it was. Over the years, we had drifted from Natalie and her ex-husband Tom. At one time, we were all incredibly close. We shared dinners, helped each other out with the kids, organized countless family gatherings, and even took vacations together. We were woven into each other's lives in a way that felt permanent. But then, one day, everything changed. I remember it clearly. I'd come home with a pounding headache, hoping to sleep it off. I took a couple of Tylenol, stretched out on the couch, and drifted off. About 30 minutes later, I heard Hannah and Natalie come back from a shopping trip, talking away, completely unaware I was lying there. That's when things took a turn I'll never forget. Natalie asked Hannah if she'd noticed the new manager at the grocery store. My heart started pounding as I lay there, waiting for Hannah's reply. Her response was casual, too casual. She mentioned that she'd seen him and thought he was cute, even saying he'd smiled at her. But then, something much worse followed. Natalie, with a laugh in her voice, said it'd be even better if he was smiling after what had happened in the back seat of her car the day before. I couldn't believe what I was hearing. To her credit, Hannah disapproved and warned Natalie, telling her she was playing with fire and could lose her husband, Tom. But Natalie brushed it off like it was no big deal, confidently saying she was always careful. They left shortly after that, but I was left reeling. As someone who prides himself on honesty and integrity, the weight of what I had overheard nearly crushed me. What should I do with this information? Tom deserved to know, right? But telling him would destroy their marriage, no question about it. I agonized over the decision, knowing full well that if Tom found out, he'd throw Natalie out without a second thought. Could I live with being the one to drop that bombshell? Before I could make up my mind, Hannah came home with the kids. A small sense of relief washed over me, knowing she hadn't condoned her sister's actions. I decided to hold off on making any drastic decisions until I could talk it over with her. That night, as we were getting ready for bed, I brought it up. I cautiously explained what I had overheard and asked her what I should do. At first, Hannah seemed unsure. I pressed on, asking whether confronting the cheater with anger was the right move. She hesitated for a moment, then told me that it depended on the situation, that there were many factors to consider. I continued, trying to get her take on things. I brought up hypothetical scenarios, asking how we'd react if Tom had been the one cheating. Would we just turn a blind eye? As I spoke, the air in the room grew heavier. Then, suddenly, Hannah sat up in bed, clutching her phone, visibly angry. She was ready to call Natalie right then and there. Instinctively, I stopped her, taking the phone from her hand and telling her I would handle it. This was my responsibility. Hannah still had doubts, asking if I was sure about what I was doing. I reassured her, telling her that Natalie needed to face the consequences. With determination in her eyes, Hannah agreed, stating that we wouldn't be letting Tom stay with us if Natalie kicked him out. She made it crystal clear. There was no way we'd offer a cheater a place to stay. So, I dialed Tom's number. When he answered, I started with a deep sigh and tried to lighten the mood, addressing him as his favorite son-in-law. He chuckled, reminding me that I was his only son-in-law, which made me the favorite by default. There was humor in his voice as he asked why I was calling so late, but the truth of what I had to say weighed heavily on my heart. After taking a deep breath, I cautiously continued, warning Tom that I had overheard a conversation and had some devastating news to share. I told him that his wife, Natalie, had been unfaithful just the day before. There was a long silence on the other end of the line as Tom absorbed this shocking revelation. When he finally spoke, his voice was low, filled with disbelief. He asked if I was absolutely sure, if it was really his Natalie. I confirmed it, explaining that I had heard it straight from her mouth, in a manner that sounded more like a boast than anything remorseful. Tom was quiet for what felt like forever before I offered my support, telling him we were there for him and his kids. He thanked me in a dazed voice and hung up the phone. When I turned around, I saw Hannah watching me, her eyes full of sadness. Tears began to well up as she whispered that she was proud of me and asked for a hug, feeling lost and scared. I held her, offering comfort as the weight of the situation settled over us both. Once we had calmed down, I gently asked if they should consider seeing a therapist, curious about what their next steps might be. Hannah, already exhausted from the emotional toll, mumbled sleepily, expressing doubts about whether therapy would change anything. She said that once someone strays, it often happens again. I quietly agreed, though neither of us wanted to think too deeply about that possibility. Suddenly, the phone rang, jolting us from our conversation. I answered groggily, careful not to disturb Hannah. Natalie's furious voice immediately filled the line, demanding to know what I had told Tom. I kept my tone calm and firm, explaining that I had told him the truth. Honesty, I emphasized, was important, no matter how painful. As I spoke, Hannah sat up, watching me with concern but also a sense of resolve. Natalie was furious, unable to believe her sister would betray her like this. I replied, still steady, that sometimes the truth just comes out, and cheaters deserve to face the consequences. At that, Natalie broke down, her anger giving way to tears. She confessed through sobs that Tom had kicked her out of the house. Her voice filled with desperation as she asked what she should do and if she could come stay with us. Without hesitation, I told her that we couldn't provide a refuge for a cheater. Natalie was stunned by my response, clearly not expecting such a harsh rejection. I turned to Hannah for guidance, unsure how to proceed, and Hannah leaned in close, speaking with surprising firmness. She told Natalie that she didn't want a cheater in our home and that Natalie needed to figure things out on her own. Relaying that message to Natalie, I told her that she was no longer welcome in our lives. She shouldn't come over, and she certainly shouldn't call. There was silence on the other end of the phone before she finally hung up. Hannah snuggled closer to me afterward, whispering how proud she was of how I had handled things, and with that, we both drifted off to sleep. Morning, however, brought the expected storm. Hannah's father called, yelling at her for what we had done. Hannah was visibly shaken after the call, tears brimming in her eyes. I reminded her that this had been our mutual decision. We had agreed that it was time to distance ourselves from the deceit in our lives, even if it meant cutting ties with family. Trying to explain, I told Hannah that the scenario I had mentioned to her before was only hypothetical. I never meant to accuse Tom of cheating. I had simply posed the question to show how the situation could be viewed differently. How was Natalie's betrayal any different? Hannah, visibly conflicted, defended her sister, saying that family was family. I couldn't hide my disappointment. Was it acceptable to turn a blind eye to cheating just because they were family? For once, Hannah didn't have an answer. 3 years ago, I had laid down a firm boundary regarding her sister. I told Hannah I didn't want Natalie near our kids or in our home. While Hannah had respected that boundary on the surface, I knew she still met her sister in secret. It was an unspoken reality in our household, a taboo that remained quietly in the background. Over time, Tom had managed to move on, and as he prepared for remarriage, I found that my resentment toward Natalie had faded. I no longer cared about her presence or absence in our lives. As things settled down, I shifted my focus back to Hannah. It felt like it was time to resolve the issue between us. Maybe, deep down, Hannah still carried some guilt for having deceived me, but I had reached a point where I no longer cared. As these thoughts churned in my mind, a strange turn of events unfolded in a dream. I was suddenly on a stage, speaking to a large audience at a congress. I began delivering a speech about 2 types of people, those who deny reality and those who face it head-on. As I spoke, Hannah's boss, James Thompson, waved from the crowd, confessing with a grin that he had evaded my wife. Ryan Mitchell, seated nearby, admitted the same. Another man chimed in with a cheeky comment, and the room erupted in shared laughter. The absurdity of it all hit me as I jolted awake on the couch, wiping drool from my face. I had fallen asleep for over an hour, and it was already midnight. Panicking, I rushed to the bedroom, hoping Hannah had come home during my nap. But there was no sign of her. Then, with a sinking realization, it dawned on me. She was probably with Natalie. Contemplating whether to call Natalie and ask about Hannah's whereabouts, I hesitated, realizing that doing so would mean acting behind Hannah's back. I thought back to when I had once needed to pick up Natalie's children from a specific location, wondering if I still had her phone number. As I prepared to search my contacts, my eyes landed on the Find My Phone app icon. A year ago, I had installed it on both my phone and Hannah's after a mishap when I lost my phone during a trip from New York to Cincinnati. I realized I could use it to track Hannah's phone. I quickly opened the app, and within seconds, it located Hannah's phone. It was at Mills Lake. I paused, puzzled. Why would she be there? Mills Lake was an upscale, exclusive area known for its luxury homes. Natalie, facing financial trouble, couldn't possibly afford to stay there, making this situation even more mysterious. Using Google Earth, I pinpointed Hannah's exact location. To my shock, she was inside a massive, private estate surrounded by an imposing stone wall. I was baffled. What was Hannah doing inside a millionaire's estate? It was an hour's drive away from our town, but the urgency to uncover the truth propelled me into action. Even though I feared she might lie or evade my questions, I needed concrete evidence before confronting her. Flooded with emotion, I headed toward Mills Lake, chastising myself for not checking her phone's location sooner. Regret washed over me as I thought of all the excuses I had made for her behavior. As I neared the estate, I found myself unsure of what I would do once I arrived. I still hoped, deep down, that there was a simple explanation. Arriving at Mills Lake, I faced a large, gated entrance to the estate where Hannah was supposedly located. I didn't plan on driving straight in and announcing my presence. It was far too risky in such an exclusive neighborhood. I parked a bit farther down the road, in a secluded area where I wouldn't attract attention. My heart pounded as I made my way toward the estate, grappling with how I would bypass the high walls. Then it hit me. The estate bordered the lake, which might offer an alternative way in. Renewed determination pushed me forward, and I found a footpath leading toward the lake shore. I followed it carefully, unsure of which mansion was the one Hannah was inside. A quick check of the GPS reassured me I was close. I soon arrived at a grand, luxurious mansion. A few windows on the second floor were illuminated, while the ground floor remained dimly lit. Only one curtain was slightly open, casting a warm glow outside. I needed a better view, so I found a sturdy tree nearby and climbed it to get a vantage point. Peering inside, I spotted a man wearing a white terry cloth robe, but I didn't recognize him. He was older than me, with graying hair, and he quickly moved out of sight. A moment later, a woman came into view. My breath caught. It was Natalie. She stood in an open robe, sipping champagne casually. Despite everything, I couldn't deny that she was still attractive at her age. It all started to make sense. Hannah was here, with Natalie. And while it seemed likely that Natalie was pursuing a wealthy partner, the thought of Hannah being drawn into this lifestyle filled me with dismay. This wasn't the life I wanted for her, and I struggled to reconcile what I was seeing with the woman I had married. Suddenly, the man from earlier reappeared. He approached Natalie and placed his hands on her body, moving her champagne glass aside as his touch became more intimate. I couldn't watch anymore. Climbing down from the tree, I averted my eyes, repulsed by the scene. The display of casual physicality felt cheap and hollow to me. I've always believed that love and intimacy should be grounded in connection and affection, not the shallow, empty displays I had just witnessed. Even though I had little respect left for Natalie, I couldn't help but feel a deep sadness at the thought of her living this kind of life. As I considered leaving, I saw something that froze me in place. On the far side of the room, I locked eyes with Hannah. She was lounging on a couch, wearing a dazed, foolish grin, clearly intoxicated. In that instant, the truth I had been trying to avoid hit me with full force. Hannah wasn't just with Natalie. She was actively part of whatever was happening in that house. My heart sank, overwhelmed by disbelief. Hannah's open robe revealed a sight that shattered the remnants of our marriage, sealing its fate. I stood frozen in shock, then instinctively stepped back, losing my footing in the tree. I tumbled to the ground, branches snapping beneath me, but thankfully, the fall left me with only minor scrapes. Yet, the pain that gripped me wasn't physical. It was the profound realization of losing the woman I once loved. Dazed, I rose to my feet, feeling as if years had been added to my age. Under the weight of the truth, I began wandering aimlessly, like a man lost in his own sorrow. Tears blurred my vision as I limped back to the car, not from the fall, but from the realization that everything I had believed in was crumbling before me. For a fleeting moment, a thought crossed my mind: to storm into the cottage, confront the betrayal head-on. But common sense prevailed. Such an action would land me in jail for trespassing or worse. Sitting in my car, alone with my thoughts, a storm of emotions brewed inside me. Denial could no longer shield me from the truth. Sadness and anger fought for dominance, but I knew that succumbing to that anger would only destroy me further. I vowed to myself that, no matter how deep my rage ran, I would never harm Hannah. I was better than that. As I considered my options, the simplest seemed to be going home, packing my things, and leaving her. In a no-fault divorce state like ours, where we had no dependent children and separate incomes, it would be easy to split our property and go our separate ways. But that felt too simple. Part of me longed for justice, or at least a chance to make her feel the weight of her betrayal. The urge to seek some form of revenge crept in, and an idea took root in my mind. An idea too tempting to ignore. With newfound resolve, I reached for my phone and dialed Hannah's number. I didn't expect her to answer, so I left a message. "Hi, honey," I said, projecting calm into my voice. "Since you didn't pick up the home phone, I'm calling your mobile. Just wanted to let you know that you might hear my keys in the door soon. We're on our way back. Flight got delayed by a blizzard, but I should be home in about 30 minutes. I hung up, knowing Hannah would get the voicemail notification. The unusual timing of the message would trigger her curiosity and panic. I imagined her reaching for her phone in a daze, her heart sinking as she realized what my message meant. If she was drunk enough, maybe she wouldn't realize that I couldn't have made that call from a plane mid-flight. Still, I knew the seeds of fear would be planted. Moments later, my phone rang. It was Hannah. I answered with a weary tone, as if I'd just woken up. "Sorry if I woke you," I said casually, though we both knew sleep was the least of her concerns. "It's fine," she replied, her voice tight with anxiety. "I'm actually on my way home. I'll be there in about an hour or so." "Okay," I responded, keeping my voice neutral, and she ended the call abruptly. A few minutes later, I watched her car tear out of the estate gates, speeding recklessly down the highway. My heart raced as I saw her veer dangerously close to the ditch on the side of the road. She was clearly more intoxicated than I had thought. Despite the anger and betrayal simmering inside me, I couldn't let her endanger herself or others. Whatever she had done, I didn't want her life to end this way. I made a quick decision. Reaching for my phone again, I dialed emergency services and reported a suspected drunk driver. I described the car's erratic behavior and gave them the make, model, and color, dark blue Ford Taurus, and the last 4 digits of the license plate. I explained that I had seen the vehicle swerving dangerously on the south side of the highway near Mills Lake and emphasized the urgency. The operator assured me that a patrol car was being dispatched to stop the vehicle. Keeping a safe distance, I followed Hannah, watching her swerve dangerously between lanes. My stomach twisted with the irony of the situation. Here I was, reporting my own wife in an effort to save her from herself, even after everything that had happened. As I trailed behind her, navigating the traffic carefully, I couldn't shake the feeling that this night would change everything forever. The simple life we had shared, the future we had once imagined, it all seemed like a distant dream, obliterated by the reality of her actions and my growing need for closure. Whatever happened next, there was no going back. 2 exits later, I spotted a patrol car approaching Hannah's location. From a distance, I could see it parked on the bridge, facing the highway. As Hannah's car came into view, the patrol car lit up its flashing lights, signaling her to pull over. I watched from a distance as she slowed down, then pulled to the side of the road. A strange mixture of relief and sadness washed over me. 45 minutes later, I arrived back home, the events of the evening weighing heavily on my mind. The irony of the situation wasn't lost on me. In one night, the life of someone I had loved deeply had been reduced to this, a cascade of unfortunate decisions and consequences. The weight of it hit me hard. As I sat in the car, I realized how close Hannah had come to losing everything, not just our marriage but possibly her life. Had she crashed, had the worst happened, my children would have been left with the aftermath of their mother's reckless choices. It was a sobering thought, a stark reminder of how fragile life truly is. But my love for Hannah wasn't the issue anymore. It wasn't that I had stopped loving her. Love doesn't vanish so easily, but I could no longer see a future for us. I couldn't imagine moving forward with someone who had shattered everything we had built together. I turned off the house phone and silenced my cell, needing solitude to process what had happened. I opened a bottle of wine, hoping it might help me make sense of the mess my life had become. As I poured the glass and took a long sip, I realized that the truth had been there all along, but I had refused to see it. For years, I had convinced myself that our love was like a fine wine, growing richer with time. But now, as I sat in silence, I realized it had soured, turning bitter like vinegar, and it was painful to accept. Hannah's betrayal wasn't just an affair. It was the culmination of years of distance and erosion in our relationship. I took another sip of wine, contemplating what had happened to us. We had spent 26 years together, 24 of them married. Our love had been the defining force of my life, and without it, I felt lost. I didn't know who I was without Hannah. The thought of continuing life without her seemed unbearable. A terrifyingly empty future stretched out before me. My mind wandered to dark places, places I had never ventured before. I wondered if I even had the strength to continue. Sitting there, overwhelmed by the weight of it all, I briefly considered the unthinkable, driving to the nearest bridge, finding solace in the darkness beneath it. But then, something stopped me. The thought of Finn and Sophie flickered into my mind. The love I felt for my children, the responsibility I had to them, pulled me back from the edge. They were my lifeline, the only thing keeping me grounded when everything else had fallen apart. In those moments, it became clear that even if I couldn't imagine life without Hannah, I had to. Not for me, but for them. The future held too much uncertainty, too much pain, but I couldn't allow myself to be consumed by it. Finn and Sophie were embarking on their own lives, and soon they would start families of their own. They still needed me, even if I felt utterly abandoned by the person I had shared my life with. I sat there for what felt like hours, slowly coming to grips with the fact that my life would never be the same. I had always made decisions with Hannah in mind. Family was the center of everything I did. My social life, my work obligations, even my free time revolved around her and the kids. I rarely ventured out on my own, except for the occasional work event, and even then, I always rushed back to be with my family. But now, I was alone, and I had no idea how to begin rebuilding my life without her. The questions haunted me. Why had she chosen this path? Why cheat instead of simply asking for a divorce? It would have hurt, yes, but it would have been an honest hurt. When had she stopped loving me? Was she simply enduring the marriage until the kids were gone, waiting for the right moment to leave? I thought we would grow closer when Finn and Sophie left home, but Hannah had already checked out. My mind replayed the image of her with the other man. It wasn't just the betrayal. It was the fact that she had become a stranger to me. A stranger who shared her life, her body, her laughter with someone else. We were no longer a couple. That reality hit me harder than anything else. But in the midst of all that pain, I clung to one thing: my children. They were my only connection to a future that felt bearable. Even though I had lost Hannah, I still had them, and they still needed me. My self-worth had taken a brutal hit, and I felt like I had nothing left. But the thought of Finn and Sophie gave me just enough strength to hold on. I knew, eventually, I would have to let go of Hannah. I would have to move forward and carve out a new life for myself, one where she was no longer my partner. But that night, as the darkness of the evening wrapped around me, I made peace with the fact that while I would always carry the memory of her in my heart, I would also carry the memory of her betrayal. The woman I had loved for so many years was now just that, a memory. I knew I had to remove myself from the situation and start fresh. Throughout my life, I had always been content with simplicity. Growing up, my family wasn't wealthy, but we had something far more valuable: love and affection. Looking around at all the material possessions that now surrounded me, I realized how little they meant. Clothes, a car, and a laptop, that was all I truly needed. The path forward was becoming clearer with every passing moment. I needed to leave. Not just physically, but emotionally too. The thought of being in the same house, in the same life, was unbearable. I could no longer bear to see the woman who had once been my everything, as every glance at her would remind me of my loss and the hollow pain inside me. With a renewed sense of determination, I rose from my chair. I didn't waste any time. I packed several bags quickly, half an hour at most. It was just shy of 6 a.m. when I finished loading everything into the car. Exhausted, but resolute, I decided to take a brief nap, knowing Hannah would likely still be in detox for a few more hours. I set an alarm on my phone for 9 a.m., closed my eyes, and let the idea of a new beginning carry me to sleep. When the alarm rang, I woke up with the same resolve. I immediately called to schedule an urgent meeting with a lawyer. After that, I went to take a shower, trying to cleanse myself, not just of the grime from the night before, but of the lingering remnants of the life I was about to leave behind. With heavy finality, I removed my wedding ring and placed it on the table by the phone. That simple act felt like the real beginning of a new chapter, one where I sought liberation, independence, and maybe, eventually, happiness again. I knew I needed to put my emotions into words, even though Hannah and I had reached a point where talking felt futile. Writing a letter was the only way I could fully express what was left unsaid. Hannah, it saddens me to acknowledge that I now see you following the same path of reckless promiscuity and loneliness as your sister. Perhaps it's a family legacy, a sad one. By the time you read this, I will have completely removed myself from your life, and we will never cross paths again. Your betrayal has left me with a pain I could never have imagined. It is beyond words, beyond measure. Yet, I am grateful for the 24 years of happiness we once shared and for our 2 wonderful children. I will be brief. May you find solace with your lover and leave behind what is now a broken family. The justice I seek is something you could never provide. Did your escapades bring you satisfaction or any sense of revenge? Judging by the grandeur of his mansion, your new partner seems wealthy. I don't have the desire to see you again or discuss any of this further. Our lawyers will handle everything, and I ask that you promptly sign the divorce papers. There's nothing left to say. By 10 a.m., I was at the bank, efficiently dealing with the practicalities of separation. I paid off our shared credit card debt and closed the accounts. Then, I withdrew a significant sum, cashing out our savings and securities. I left enough in the checking account to cover the mortgage and utilities for the next 2 months, ensuring there'd be no disruption to the house while things were finalized. Afterward, I removed my name from the joint account and left the bank holding a check for $250,000. By noon, I arrived at work, surprising my boss, who had expected me to be out of town. I shared the news of my immediate resignation, and his shock quickly turned to understanding. Over the years, our relationship had evolved from a typical boss-employee dynamic into something more akin to a partnership. 2 years ago, during his divorce, I had declined a promotion to support him, knowing he needed stability. Our bond grew stronger after that. When I explained that I needed to leave and relocate, he surprised me with an offer. Instead of going through the formal resignation process and cashing out my 401k, he proposed a position in their new optical division in a different city. The salary would be lower, but the cost of living there was affordable, and it presented an opportunity to start fresh in a new place. We shook hands, agreeing that he would spread the word that I had left voluntarily. It was a relief to know I had a new path laid before me, even if it was a smaller one. The next step was to meet with my lawyer. I explained my decision to separate from Hannah and instructed him to serve her with divorce papers as soon as possible. I granted her the power of attorney to sell the house, as it represented half of our total assets. I wanted the process to be as smooth and efficient as possible, ensuring that both of us could move on without any further entanglements. As I left the lawyer's office, I felt a strange mixture of grief and freedom. My life had been shattered, but I had taken the first steps toward rebuilding it. There would be difficult days ahead, but at least they would be my own. I no longer had to live in the shadow of Hannah's betrayal. Now, I was free to create something new, something better. Although my lawyer, who was also a close family friend, tried to persuade me to consider different possibilities, he soon realized that my mind was made up. By midnight, I would be in another city, in another state, and without a wife. It was the only way forward. By the afternoon, I was overcome with fatigue, both physical and emotional. I needed rest, and around 8 p.m., I found a dated motel that seemed as good a place as any to stop for the night. Using a disposable phone I had bought for the journey, I called Finn. I explained that this was my new number, and we had a difficult conversation. He asked if I had heard from Mom, and I told him that I'd learned of her affair just the day before. Finn was visibly shaken but expressed his disappointment and concern, asking me what I planned to do next. I told him I had already taken care of everything. I had packed my belongings, closed the bank accounts, resigned from my job, and was on my way south to start over. I also mentioned that Hannah would receive the divorce papers by the end of the week. Finn asked if Sophie knew. I told him that she didn't yet, but I would speak with her soon. I reassured him that I would keep in touch, that I loved him, and that I would take care of myself. After we exchanged goodbyes, I braced myself for the conversation with Sophie. Talking to Sophie was even harder. Her sadness was palpable, and I could hear the weight of my words sinking in. Like Finn, she tried to process the painful truth about her mother's actions and how they had torn our family apart. She had witnessed the damage Aunt Natalie had caused to her own family and was struggling to understand how her mother could inflict the same pain on us. It seemed impossible, yet it had happened. Sophie, never one to hold back, asked me bluntly how long this had been going on and when our family had ceased to be enough for her mother. I told her that the timeline no longer mattered. What mattered was that I had loved her mother deeply, trusted her completely, and that trust had been shattered. I reassured Sophie not to worry and promised her that I would be okay, even though, at that moment, I was still grieving. I told her I believed I would heal in time, especially if I kept my distance from her mother. I also assured her that once her school year ended, she could come visit me at my new place. I could feel the tears welling up as I made that promise. I wanted her to know that, no matter what, there would always be a place for her by my side. In Tucson, the optics division I had joined was small, with just 30 employees. The district manager, who resembled his father more than a typical boss, fostered a sense of camaraderie within the team. I was welcomed with warmth, and it provided a much-needed sense of solace during this painful transition. A month later, I found a beautiful house in a condominium. It wasn't large, but it was peaceful, offering the fresh start I desperately needed. During this time, I maintained no contact with Hannah, relying only on updates from my lawyer and children. Moving forward wasn't without its complications. A particularly challenging moment came when my lawyer informed me that Hannah was ready to contest the divorce. She didn't want to proceed and was prepared to fight, even if it meant financial ruin for both of us. She wanted to salvage something, anything, from the wreckage. I calmly instructed my lawyer not to fight it. I was done. I told him to tell her that I had no desire to continue the marriage, and I wished her well. I even added that, if he felt inclined, he could tell her to go to hell for good measure. My lawyer, knowing our long history, jokingly said he'd do it with pleasure, but would have to charge an extra $1.50 for the service. Conversations with the kids were tougher. Each time, I had to convince them that there was no going back. The first significant hurdle came when Sophie told me that her mother had freaked out when she mentioned wanting to live with me for the summer. I promised Sophie I'd visit her and her grandparents, but Hannah's reaction had shaken her, and I could tell it wasn't going to be an easy summer for either of them. Finn had similar issues when he decided to split his summer between us. I didn't ask about Hannah's reaction, but I could imagine it. My priority was moving forward, but it wasn't simple. Lingering feelings for Hannah, memories of the life we had before the betrayal, complicated the healing process. Still, with the help of Finn and Sophie, I slowly learned more about Hannah's state of mind. It turned out she was going through a deep depression, one that mirrored the emotional shock I had experienced when I first found out about the affair. The irony was almost unbelievable, especially given what had happened to her sister. The truth is, when you betray the ones you're supposed to love, it hurts them deeply, and in the process, it often destroys the marriage. And yet, life goes on for the person who cheated, even if it's hollow. Hannah's actions had torn our family apart, but now, she was living with the consequences. It was a bitter reminder that, sometimes, the very act of hurting someone else is what brings you the deepest pain in the end. So how could Hannah be depressed when I had done everything to help her move on without me? Her reluctance to finalize the divorce seemed like an attempt to escape from reality, to avoid confronting the mess her actions had made of our lives. It was absurd, really. For a few hours, I found myself in denial, but Hannah had been living in denial for the past 2 years. Despite knowing that our children were in regular contact with me, she used them as a means to express remorse, trying to convince me through them that she was willing to do anything to prove her love. I understood that our children hoped for reconciliation, but I couldn't bring myself to agree to talk to Hannah. The geographical distance made it harder for them to balance their relationships with both of us. Hannah's determination to track me down was relentless. After almost 3 years, she finally discovered my location. One fateful day, leaving work, I spotted her lurking near the office. How she found out where I lived was a mystery, given that I had kept that information strictly confidential based on what my children had shared with me. Hannah believed that a face-to-face meeting would be enough to change my mind, but I was set on dispelling her misconceptions. I quickly and discreetly slipped out through a side door, heart racing, and called Clara to inform her of the situation. Knowing my plan, I deliberately placed myself within Hannah's sight, hoping to mislead her. I drove around the city, made a stop at the grocery store, and then returned home. When I arrived, Clara, a beautiful 30-year-old Latina, opened the door. A moment later, Hannah rang the doorbell and Clara, cradling a 1-year-old baby, rushed to open it. From the kitchen, I watched Hannah's astonishment upon seeing Clara. Clara greeted her with a distinct Spanish accent and asked how she could help. Hannah explained her desire to speak with me. At that moment, Clara called out to me from the doorway, and I took the baby in my arms. Clara told me to take care of our daughter while she finished preparing dinner. I turned to Hannah, a mix of surprise and irony in my voice, and began, well. Meeting her gaze, I asked what she wanted after almost 3 years apart. She responded in a barely audible whisper, confessing her need to apologize and express her deep remorse for the pain she had caused. She acknowledged that the fault was hers and not mine, and she expressed her continued love for me, describing me as the best husband and father a woman could hope for, while admitting her thoughtlessness and genuine regret. I found her apologies moving but knew it was essential to end this charade promptly. I replied, well, it's all right, feigning happiness. As they say, all of this is in the past. I haven't dwelled on these memories for so long that I can genuinely say I forgive you. I looked at the baby in my arms, who radiated joy, and added, in conclusion, I sincerely wish you a joyful life, filled with love, much like mine. Hannah's tears streamed down her face as she mumbled something unintelligible. She hesitantly approached, embraced me, and hurriedly left the house. I closed the door behind her. Clara, noticing my fragile state, emerged from the kitchen, feeling both relieved and sad. She gently took the baby from my arms, sensing my need for comfort. I leaned against the closed door, giving in to tears. Clara hugged me tightly and planted a gentle kiss on my forehead. With determination, she reached for the phone, saying, I need to let Gideon know that I'll be heading back home with our daughter soon. Her voice exuded warmth and confidence. I whispered, thank you, Clara, sincerely appreciative of her presence and unwavering support. I instructed her to tell Gideon I'd be at the barbecue on Saturday, and she responded enthusiastically, absolutely, boss. I'll see you at the office tomorrow. The following week, my lawyer received the divorce papers, duly signed by Hannah. As I moved forward, I realized that healing takes time, and I needed to find my own pace. I formed connections with several female friends, engaging in a close relationship with only one, without any serious commitments. It seemed I was finally moving past the pain inflicted on me. My fear of women diminished, and I began to consider the possibility of allowing Clara to introduce me to a kind and suitable woman. Trusting her judgment, I thought it might be time to meet someone who could bring genuine happiness into my life. But then, an unexpected encounter made me reconsider my decision. Not about leaving Hannah, that choice was still steadfast, but about my earlier assumption that we had nothing in common and that we had nothing left to discuss. Listening to fragments of Hannah's story during our conversation made me question if I should have avoided this confrontation. Despite my aversion to it, it seemed that Hannah's apology gave me a sense of closure. It released me from the pain I had been carrying and offered a glimmer of hope for love once more. Over time, I might even contemplate revealing that I don't actually have a second daughter, though I'm not certain I'll decide to do so. I no longer owe Hannah anything, and the choice to disclose or keep it to myself is mine alone. I have unburdened myself of obligations to her, allowing me to move forward and begin a new chapter in my life. But then came the day I stood by Hannah's grave with my children and numerous relatives, including Natalie. I wept bitterly, like everyone else, but I didn't see a single tear on Natalie's face. Hannah, in a state of complete despair and inebriation, had been involved in a fatal accident. Her life couldn't be saved. I contemplated why Natalie had encouraged her sister into a relationship with her lover and arrived at one explanation. It was revenge for Hannah and me revealing Natalie's betrayal, which had led to the end of her marriage with Tom. Perhaps Natalie felt some relief now that her sister was gone. One thing is certain, I will never love any woman the way I loved Hannah.